Hello, my name is Olivia Hapanowitz, and today I will be discussing the asbestos poisoning in Libby, Montana. The objectives of this presentation are to understand the source of asbestos exposure, to analyze the destruction of asbestos on the human body, and to look at where Libby stands today. The table of contents: first we'll review the history of vermiculite asbestos mining, then we'll get into some of the characteristics of asbestos exposure and the resulting disease development. Finally, we'll look at long-term effects of asbestos exposure as well as the cleanup process at this site. From 1920s through 1990, vermiculite from the Zonolite Mountain was mined, processed, and shipped across the United States. The W.R. Grayson Company mine produced 80% of the supply of vermiculite globally. Vermiculite is a mineral that is extremely versatile, and it is a high-demand product because it is used in insulation, plaster, concrete, packing materials, fertilizers, animal feed, and other industrial merchandise. Unfortunately, during this period of operation, it was unknown that the vermiculite minerals were heavily contaminated with asbestos due to random geologic formations. To quantify the level of exposure, the amount of asbestos within the vermiculite minerals and the working conditions were measured. Asbestos composed approximately 21 to 26% per vermiculite ore, and dust particles within the mill contained 40% of asbestos particles. The spread of this contaminated vermiculite. The map on the left is a map of Libby, Montana. You can see the mine is in the top right, and it's important to note the spatial proximity of the mine to the city of Libby, as well as to the two main water sources, the Kootenai River and Freeney Creek. The figure on the right is a map of the United States, and each of these cities contained a processing plant that received vermiculite from Libby, Montana. So the scope of this asbestos contamination is exacerbated when you analyze the spread of these minerals to these processing plants. The effect of asbestos on the human body. Two potential routes of exposure in Libby, Montana were determined, both via inhalation. The first is particles in the surrounding air and soil in the community released from plant emissions and vermiculite waste in storage were inhaled. And the second, particles on the clothing and hair of workers were released into the home, exposing family members. The maximum exposure levels of asbestos in the air, soil, and dust are provided here, and these are set by the EPA and OSHA. Related health hazards include asbestosis, inflammation and scarring of the lungs, and cancer. Confounding variables in disease development include the length of exposure, the dose and the type of asbestos, any medical predispositions that person may have, and the origin of exposure. Symptoms of asbestos-related disease are cough, chest pain, shortness of breath, anemia, and difficulty swallowing. And finally, the populations at risk are miners, construction, and textile workers, as well as their family members. Health consequences of the asbestos exposure. A cohort study performed among the workers of Libby between 1960 through 2001 found 420 deaths attributed to asbestos exposure. As you can see in the pie chart, the causes of death range from COPD, asbestosis, other non-malignant respiratory disease, cancer of the trachea, bronchus, or lung, possible mesothelioma, and all other types of cancer. These numbers are quite astonishing, and the true scope of the asbestos exposure of the miners and of the processing workers is quite apparent. How does this compare to national mortality averages? So based on the same data from 1960 to 2001, I created this bar graph here on the left, which analyzes the observed deaths versus the expected deaths among these workers for each disease of interest. And as you can see in each disease category, the observed number of deaths here in Libby is much greater than what we would normally expect. It's very clear that the workers in the city suffered in excess from asbestos-related diseases. This data is corroborated by independent findings from the CDC, which concluded that the workers from Libby were at a 166 greater risk of dying from asbestosis, at a 2 times greater risk of dying from lung cancer, and at a 15 times greater risk of dying from mesothelioma. Long-term effects. The health consequences of this asbestos poisoning is ongoing today. Many of these related diseases have long latency periods, so population members who were in childhood or in adolescence throughout the 1960s to the 1990s are still now being diagnosed with these life-threatening diseases. This bar graph on the right is similar to the previous one, however, this is data from 2000 to 2016. And you can see, again, for lung cancer, mesothelioma, and asbestosis, the observed number of deaths among these workers in Libby is much greater than what we would expect 10, 20, 30 years later. There is light at the end of the tunnel. So as year of exposure increased from 1920, lung function, which was measured by prevalence of plaques in the pleural, significantly decreased. And researchers believe that this data suggests the citizens of Libby are near the end of this generational wide effect of this asbestos exposure. The cleanup. In 2002, Libby was listed by the EPA as a Superfund site, and it was also declared as a public health emergency in 2009. This was actually the first time this had happened, and it allowed victims of asbestos exposure to receive health care funded by the federal government. Over the course of 16 years, approximately 2,600 properties in Libby and nearby towns were cleaned. This resulted in the removal of 1 million cubic yards of waste containing asbestos particles, and it allowed the EPA to finally declare Libby as an environmentally safe location to live. In summary, vermiculite minerals of the Zonolite Mountain in Libby, Montana were unknowingly contaminated. Miners, workers processing these products, and the citizens in Libby were exposed to high levels of asbestos. An EPA investigation in 2002 discovered these high levels and began a 16-year cleanup project. Today, plant workers continue to suffer from several asbestos-related diseases at increased rates, and the people continue to live in Libby, Montana today. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.